When you board a cruise ship or a ferry, you put your life in the hands of the captain and his crew. The last thing you expect in an emergency is that he abandons ship, leaving you to fend for yourself. This video is a compilation of videos that are already published on this channel about captains that abandon ship before their passengers, with increasing levels of devastation. If you've seen one of these videos, you can skip ahead using the timestamps in the video's description. The Agulhas Current flows down the east coast of South Africa. It's the most powerful ocean current on the globe. In 1991, the Oceanus loses a fight against the current, 40-knot winds, 9-meter swell, poor maintenance, and bad decisions. Oceanus was a French-built and Greek-owned cruise ship. The ship was originally launched in July 1952 as the Jean Laborde in Four Chantiers de la Gironde in Bordeaux as the last of 4 sister ships constructed for Messageries Maritimes. Perhaps you can let me know in the comments how badly I've butchered those French names. It's 153 meters long, 20 meters at the beam, draws 7 meters below the waterline, and has a capacity of 550 passengers plus 250 crew. Its first charter as a passenger ship is the route between Marseille, Madagascar, and Mauritius. Over a period of more than 20 years, it undergoes several name changes, including Mykonai, Ancona, and Eastern Princess, before being registered in Piraeus in Greece as Oceanus in 1976. Originally built as an ocean-going passenger vessel, the Oceanus undergoes massive reconstruction before it begins to operate as a cruise liner for Epiroutiki Lines of Greece. Between 1988 and 1991, Epiroutiki Lines loses 2 vessels. Their flagship Pegasus catches fire and sinks in shallow water, and motor vessel Jupiter collides with a freight ship and sinks in 82 meters of water, taking 4 lives with it. In 1991, Oceanus is chartered by TFC Tours of Johannesburg in South Africa for an 8-month season. The ship is almost 40 years old and shows signs of wear and tear. There are several loose hull plates, which are the sheets of metal that form the outer hull of the ship. On a recent trip to Mozambique, the ship experiences problems with sewage water rising up through some showers and toilets. The repairs start by removing several faulty non-return valves from the sewage holding tanks. The ventilation pipe is also removed from the sewage tank, leaving a 10-centimeter hole between the generator room and the holding tank. The repairs are not finalized. The non-return valves and ventilation pipe are not replaced. At 1500 on the 3rd of August 1991, the Oceanus departs from East London in South Africa en route to Durban. Its departure time is delayed because of a bomb threat. Captain Yanis Avranis, a seasoned mariner with 20 years experience as an officer and 30 as a seaman, is at the helm. As the ship heads into 40-knot winds and confronts towering 9-meter swell, the sea conditions grow increasingly turbulent. The usual sail-away party with musicians and entertainers, Moss Hills and his wife Tracy, is scheduled to take place on deck. The rough seas force them to change the venue for the shelter inside the Four Seasons Lounge. Despite Moss, Tracy, and the ship's entertainment crew's best efforts to create a festive atmosphere, most passengers opt to stay in their cabins to ride out the storm. The storm intensifies as the evening wears on. During the first sitting of dinner, the waiters struggle to maintain their balance, making it difficult to carry food trays without spilling. Cutlery slides off the dining tables while the ship rolls in the swell and wind. Just what you want on an ocean cruise. Ships have an opening to the sea below the waterline called a sea chest. This allows the ship to draw ocean water to cool the engines and distribute to ballast tanks. The sea chest has sprung a leak. At 21:30 off the wild coast of the Transkei, there's a small explosion in the engine room. Then the ship loses power. The ship's engineer reports to Captain Avranis that water is breaching the hull, flooding the generator room, which has created a small explosion as the generator short circuits. Without power, the engines die and the ship begins to drift in the heavy seas. The water level continues to rise until it reaches the 10 centimeter hole in the bulkhead where the air vent pipe should be. Seawater breaches the bulkhead and fills the sewage tank. With the non-return valves in this holding tank removed for repairs, water travels up through the main drainage pipes. Showers, toilets, and waste disposal units connected to the system allow water to flow from the sea chest through the sewage holding tank and up into the cabins. The crew in the engine room escape the flooding compartments. In their panic, they don't close the lower deck bulkhead hatches, which is standard procedure during an emergency situation. With the engine snuffed, the ship loses any stability created from its momentum through the swell. As the ship rolls idle through the rough seas, waves slam against the deteriorating exterior hull plates. The crew don't sound the alarms, nor make any announcements to alert the passengers to the situation they're facing. Moss Hills, a musician from Zimbabwe, and his wife Tracy, along with their fellow entertainers, notice the ship rolling in a way that doesn't feel normal. The ship is listing to starboard. They decide to investigate. As they head below decks, they find water flooding through the cabins and into the passageways. The Oceanus is sinking. Lorraine Betts, the cruise director, tells them that the captain has given the order to the crew to abandon ship. Crew members make their way to the lifeboats and start to evacuate the ship. They take on board any passengers immediately available, but don't fill the lifeboats before making their escape. They don't even fill the lifeboats before cutting the lines. Moss and Tracy waste no time and start launching the remaining lifeboats with up to 90 passengers in each one. The lifeboat's engines don't start, and so they drift with the current, the wind, and the waves. As the ship lists further to starboard, it becomes too dangerous to continue launching lifeboats. Almost 220 people remain on board the sinking ship. Moss Hills and several passengers make their way up to the bridge to find crew members who can help with the evacuation. The bridge is unmanned. Moss uses the radio to broadcast a distress call. Captain Detmar on board the container ship Ned Lloyd Mauritius responds to the Mayday call. Moss explains the situation, that he's the guitarist on board and that the crew are not on the bridge. After a short pause to take in the staggering incompetence, Captain Detmar starts to give Moss information on how to handle the situation. He then broadcasts the coordinates of the Oceanus and requests ships in the vicinity to provide assistance and relays the situation to the South African authorities. The South African Navy and the South African Air Force dispatch 16 helicopters to assist with the search and rescue operation. These helicopters are tasked with airlifting the passengers and crew to the nearby settlements of The Haven and Hole in the Wall, approximately 6 miles south of Coffee Bay on the Wild Coast. Captain Detmar on the Ned Lloyd Mauritius deploys his lifeboats and crew to take passengers on board. The first helicopter to arrive lowers 2 Navy divers onto the deck of the Oceanus to help coordinate the evacuation. Captain Avranus is first in line. Navy diver Paul Wiley pushes him aside and tells him to wait until women, children, and elderly passengers are evacuated. Wiley then steps away to find an elderly passenger, and when he returns, Avranus has pushed the passengers aside, strapped himself in, and is being hoisted to safety. Among the 16 rescue helicopters are 13 South African Air Force Pumas, 9 of which are engaged in hoisting the 220 people off the deck of the sinking vessel, while the rest search the area for survivors. The rescue helicopters perform an aerial ballet, lifting passengers from the forward and aft decks. The helicopters take turns to load passengers, fly them to shore, and return to the ship. Cruise director Lorraine Betts ensures the elderly, women, and children receive priority. Entertainers Julian Butler, Moss Hills, Tracy Hills, and Robert Boltman are among the last 5 people to be winched from the deck of the sinking ship. All 581 people on board make it safely to shore during a 7-hour rescue operation. At 15:30 the following day, Oceanus starts to tilt over to one side and its stern rises up. The bow hits the sandy seabed about 90 meters deep. More than 60 meters of the stern stands above the water. Minutes later, the ship slowly slips beneath the waterline. The Oceanus comes to rest on its starboard side with its bow facing out to sea. Captain Avranus gets caught in the spotlight. Much like the captain of the Costa Concordia, Avranus leaves the ship while hundreds of passengers wait to be rescued, with only the ship's entertainers to assist in the evacuation. He defends his actions, claiming he left the ship early to organize the rescue efforts and then supervise the rescue from a helicopter. Avranus says the dead batteries of the crew's walkie-talkies are the cause of the communication obstacle.
When I order abandon the ship, it doesn't matter what time I leave. Abandon is for everybody. If some people like to stay, they can stay.
Despite his explanation, the media portrays him as an example of unprofessional behavior while in command. In 1992, Captain Avranus and other officers are found guilty of negligence by a Greek board of inquiry for fleeing the ship without aiding the passengers during the crisis. Avranus doesn't do any jail time, and his employer, Epiratiki Lines, gives him command of a ferry until his retirement. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to watch more videos from this channel without any ads, please consider joining our Patreon. The link is in the description. You can join for free or select a membership with benefits ranging from ad-free videos through to early access and live Q&A calls. I look forward to meeting you there.
Vikings sacrificed a slave to their god of the sea when they launched a ship. Today, tradition is to break a bottle of champagne against the hull of a ship. It's considered bad luck if the bottle doesn't break. Perhaps Costa Concordia was doomed from the beginning. The Costa Concordia is owned and operated by the famous Italian cruise line Costa Cruises, part of Carnival Corporation, which controls 50% of the world's cruise ships. It's launched in 2005 at a cost of $600 million, and it's one of Italy's largest cruise ships. It's 952 feet long, 116 feet wide, and draws 26 feet, which means when the ship is floating, 26 feet is below the waterline. The ship weighs 60,000 tons. That means it needs to displace 24 Olympic-sized swimming pools of water in order to float. The lower decks below the waterline house the mechanical functions of the ship, including the engine room and a diesel-electric power plant. Above the waterline are 1,500 luxury cabins, 6 restaurants, 13 bars, a 2-story spa and fitness center, a 3-story theater, 4 swimming pools, a casino, disco, and a host of entertainment for more than 3,000 guests. The ship's equipped with state-of-the-art technology on the bridge, electronic charts that show the GPS position on screen, and fathometers showing how much water is underneath the hull. Routes are programmed into the system, and any deviation from the route triggers an alarm. When a cruise ship does a sail past of an island, these alarms are triggered and have to be manually acknowledged and turned off by personnel on the bridge. A sail past, similar to a flyby, is common practice in the world of cruise ships. On the 14th of August 2011, the Costa Concordia is asked by the company's management to do a sail past of Giglio Island as a salute to celebrate a festival on the island. Captain Francesco Schettino accommodates the request, and the Concordia sails past during the day without incident. In order to achieve a sail past that deviates from the predetermined passage plan, a ship's crew must plan and coordinate the route. They start by checking the charts to understand the depth of the local waters and determine a safe distance from shallow water. They then need to factor in the weather conditions. Will the wind blow them towards or away from the island at the time they sail past? Then they need to plan the rudder controls of the ship. If you sail a small yacht close to shallow waters, you can change direction quite quickly. A large ship like the Costa Concordia takes time to alter course because of its size and momentum. That means you need to preempt the position and direction of a ship and make adjustments to your course long before the ship will respond in full. At 1900, on the 13th of January 2012, the Costa Concordia set sail from Civitavecchia, Italy for a 7-day cruise. The first planned stop is at Savona on the Italian Riviera, 250 miles northwest. There are over 1,000 crew members and more than 3,000 passengers for a total head count of 4,229 souls on board. Around 600 passengers join the ship at Civitavecchia. Within 24 hours, all passengers must take part in an evacuation drill. In this mandatory drill, passengers will learn what an evacuation alarm sounds like, where the lifeboats are, where their muster station is, and what to do in the event of an emergency. But for now, the ship gets underway and the passengers settle into life at sea. 51-year-old Captain Francesco Schettino is entertaining 25-year-old Dominica Camorton, a dancer from Moldova who is a non-paying guest of the captain. The captain is married and has a daughter, but perhaps the captain of a large vessel has some perks that aren't named in the job description. Schettino lets his crew know that he intends to do a sail-past salute to Giglio Island. The crew slow the ship while the captain goes for dinner. First Officer Ciro Ambrosio routes the ship towards Giglio Island. He switches off the ship's alarm that starts to warn him of his deviation from the plotted course. Schettino and his guest have dinner together, and then Schettino takes her to the bridge at 2100. The ship's maitre d', Antonello Tiavoli, who's from the island of Giglio, is already there. Schettino's mentor, a retired coast captain, Mario Palombo, lives on the island. Schettino has numerous reasons to perform a salute to Giglio Island: a young lady to impress, his mentor, and his maitre d'. The crew now bring the ship's speed up to 16 knots to make up for the time the captain was at dinner. While the maitre d' makes a phone call to the retired coast captain, Schettino asks First Officer Ambrosio to check the radar for him. The captain's left his reading glasses in his cabin. The maitre d' hands Schettino the phone for the two captains to catch up. Schettino asks the retired captain for advice on how close he can sail to Giglio. He says he wants to go as close as 0.4 nautical miles, around 2,500 feet from the shoreline. The retired captain tells him there's good depth but no need to sail so close because there's very few people on the island in winter. In fact, he's at his winter home on the mainland. Captain Schettino has done the sail pass before, and he's possibly humoring the retired captain by asking for his advice. What strikes me is that Captain Schettino is asking another captain about depths when he should be consulting the charts which show the depths around the island. Now his concentration is split between a radar screen he can't read, a phone call in which he's getting advice not to sail too close, and you can almost get a sense of his bravado. I'm the captain now, I've done this before, I know what I'm doing, I can see the island. And while he's on the phone, the ship is closing on the island at a speed that's designed to make up time, not maneuver around an island. Captain Schettino is now navigating by sight and not by the instruments. He orders the helmsman to start the turn to starboard, which will turn the ship to the right in order to line up with the harbor of Giglio. But now he realizes that the ship is closer to the island than he had anticipated, and he sees a rocky outcrop below the waterline to the left of the ship. Instinctively, he shouts an order to turn the ship hard to starboard, which means the helmsman turns the rudder all the way to the right. The bow of the ship swings out to starboard and misses the rocks. If you're driving a car and you turn the wheel, the back wheels follow the path of the front wheels. But a ship is different. When you steer the rudder of a ship, the ship rotates around the middle of the ship's hull, which acts like a fulcrum. So, as the Costa Concordia's bow swings to starboard, the stern of the ship swings out to port. Schettino realizes his mistake and shouts the next order, hard to port, to counteract his previous order. For a moment, the bow and the midship pass the rocks. Many of the passengers are at dinner when there's a sudden loud bang followed by a long creaking, groaning and screeching sound of metal buckling like a tin can. The ship shakes and shudders. Glasses fall from the shelves of the bar. Plates slide off the dinner tables and crash to the floor. The ship strikes the rocky outcrop just off the Tuscan island of Giglio. The reef is known as La Scole and can be seen on the ship's charts around 2,600 feet from the harbor. The Costa Concordia makes contact with the reef 26 feet below the waterline on the port side towards the stern, gouging two long sheets of metal out of the hull of the ship, 160 feet long. A rock the size of a small car is embedded in the ship's hull. Seawater starts to flood the engine room, submerging the generators and engines. The lights flicker and go out, leaving passengers in the dark. Panic starts to spread throughout the ship, but the emergency lights come on almost immediately. The chief engineer reports to the bridge that water is flooding the engine room and that the ship will sink. The seawater rises quickly to the engine control room's main switchboard level. The lower decks of the ship are divided into large compartments. If 4 of these compartments are flooded, the ship could sink. Captain Schettino on the bridge can see that multiple instruments aren't working. At 21:45 p.m., an alarm is sounded. 2 long whistles and 1 short, informing the crew of a problem. At 21:50, the ship begins to list. It's tilting to port, which is to the side where water is flooding the engine rooms. Crew on board the ship tell the passengers that everything is okay and that there's an electrical fault. Everything is now under control and to please enjoy the rest of the evening. At 21:57, 15 minutes after the ship strikes the rock, Schettino phones Costa Cruises Operations Center. He tells executive Roberto Ferrarini 1 compartment is flooded, the compartment with electrical propulsion motors, and with that kind of situation, the ship's buoyancy is not compromised. Schettino has not understood the severity of the impact. 5 compartments are flooding and he hasn't listened to his chief engineer. The Coast Guard starts getting calls from passengers on the ship. They locate the Concordia on their radar near Giglio 6 minutes after the first call at 22:12. They radio the ship and ask what the situation is. The ship's navigation officer, 26-year-old Simone Canessa, responds that there's only an electrical blackout. She's under strict instructions from the captain to downplay the situation and insist that everything is under control, despite knowing that the ship is taking on water. The Coast Guard asks if they need assistance, and the officer replies that they don't need any help at the moment. The engines are dead, computer screens have gone black. The ship is drifting and losing speed. Its momentum carries it north along the island's coastline past the harbor, then past a rocky peninsula called Point Gabionara. Schettino's last move is to lock the rudder hard to starboard. The ship's momentum carries it forward, eventually turning it through the wind and completing a 180-degree turn. The wind now pushes the ship back towards the island. The water flooding the lower decks along with the wind now shift the weight of the ship, which starts to shift the list from port to starboard. Schettino drops the ship's anchors, but they don't bite into the seabed. The Coast Guard make another call to the bridge of the Concordia. This time, the navigator informs them they're taking on water and listing. At 22:26, Schettino speaks to Roberto Ferrarini at Costa's Operations Center and tells him that 2 compartments are flooded and that he's maneuvering the ship to land. The reality is that he has no control. The wind and what's left of the ship's momentum is carrying it towards the rocks. At 22:28, the Coast Guard send an emergency call for all boats in the area to descend on Giglio Island. By 22:44, the Costa Concordia comes to rest at Punta del Gabionara in about 65 feet of water. Passengers on the Concordia are confused and uncertain. Captain Schettino leaves the bridge in shock and looks out over the ship. 3,200 passengers don't know what to do. Over 1,000 crew are equally confused. The second captain, Roberto Bozio, starts an early evacuation before the official orders are given. This decision by junior officers and crew is considered mutiny because they're acting without instructions from the captain. Some crew are ordering life rafts into the water and others are recommending passengers return to their cabins. There is no clear leadership. At 22:58, 7 short whistles and 1 long one sound out, signaling the lifeboats to be deployed and for the ship to be evacuated. Almost 2,000 people have been standing on deck for an hour, waiting, knowing what's going to happen, but not knowing how to proceed. The 600 people who joined the ship a few short hours ago haven't taken part in any evacuation drill. It's planned for the following day. Because the Concordia is listing to starboard, it's impossible to lower lifeboats from the port side. Some passengers jump into the cold winter waters to swim to shore. As crew begin opening the lifeboat gates, chaos breaks out. Someone calls out, "Women and children first," driving the panic to a frenzy. The first lifeboats arrive in Giglio's harbor just after 2300. Mario Pellegrini, Giglio's deputy mayor, gets to the harbor and makes his way to the ship on a lifeboat, only to find there's no one in charge. Passengers are climbing down rope ladders on the side of the ship while boats pull alongside to take them on board. In a window of an hour and 15 minutes, almost 3,500 people make it to the safety of Giglio's harbor. At 23:45, a rescue helicopter arrives. By 12:15, just after midnight, nearly everyone on the ship's starboard side have evacuated the ship, including Captain Schettino and some of his officers. But not everyone is off the ship. Some who have boarded lifeboats are forced back onto the ship. As the ship settles onto the rocks, she slowly lists until she finally stops rolling at almost 70 degrees, rendering some lifeboats useless. At 12:42 a.m., Gregorio De Falco, who's in charge of the Coast Guard's rescue operations, calls Captain Schettino on his mobile phone. Captain Schettino explains that he fell into a lifeboat and he's sitting on a rock outside the harbor of Giglio. De Falco, an ex-commander from the Italian Navy, loses his shit and yells at Schettino, "Get the back on board, you prick." Schettino tells him that he'll coordinate the rescue from his rock. At 0100, almost 1,000 people are still on board. Rescue boats and helicopters continue the evacuation, picking up people from the water and the ship. At 0446, the evacuation is logged as complete. Fire rescue teams begin searching for survivors. 32 people are dead or missing. Schettino never did go back to the ship to help with the evacuation. Survivors are transported to the port of Santo Stefano, where a coordination and assistance center is established. Authorities issue a ban on all private boats and implement a 1 nautical mile non-navigation zone around the ship. Between the 14th and 30th of January, the Italian Navy, Coast Guard, and Fire and Rescue Service divers search the ship for missing people. The head of the Italian Coast Guard, Marco Brusco, confirms that 29 people, 4 crew members and 25 passengers are still unaccounted for. Pitch black conditions and drifting furniture in the ship creates a dangerous environment for rescuers. Divers work in pairs. They use a zigzag search pattern in assigned areas. Dives are planned for 40 minutes each. They mark their route with cave lines for orientation in low visibility and position emergency air tanks inside the ship. They can't see further than 2 feet in front of them. Rescuers find survivors, including a South Korean newlywed couple who slept through the event and the ship's purser who has a broken leg. On the 16th of January, rescue work is interrupted when bad weather shifts the ship about 1.5 centimeters. The risk is that it could slide into deeper waters or that fuel could leak. Operations continue 3 hours later. Rescuers use explosives to create access holes in the ship's hull. The ship continues to shift periodically until the 24th of January, when it's declared stable by the head of the Italian Civil Protection Agency. By the end of January 2012, the total number of bodies recovered is 17. On the 31st of January, the search below the waterline is terminated. In February, reports from survivors give the rescuers information about the last known location of some passengers. Based on this, divers find 8 more bodies in the wreck. Dutch salvage firm Smit International and Italian company Neri begin removing the vessel's 2,380 tons of heavy fuel. They first focus on emptying the 15 tanks holding about 84% of the vessel's fuel, which takes almost a month to complete. They use a process called hot tapping. Because the tanks are submerged, commercial divers are brought in to complete the work. First, divers install a valve at the bottom of a fuel tank and another at the top. The thick oil is warmed to make it slightly less viscous. Seawater is pumped into the bottom of the tank to replace the oil that is pumped out of the top valve. Because oil floats on water, as the oil is removed, the seawater replaces the oil from the bottom of the tank and ensures that the tank remains negatively buoyant and doesn't destabilize the ship. This process is repeated until all 15 tanks are empty on the 24th of March. Next, divers cut a hole in the hull to access the flooded engine room. They clear nearly 350 cubic meters of diesel fuel and other lubricants from the engine room. Outside the ship, robotic search and rescue equipment is used to find another 5 bodies between the wreck and the seabed. After the fuel and oils are removed, the process of removing the wreck begins. There are two options. They can dismantle the wreck in place, or they can float it and then dismantle it in a dry dock, which is what they decide to do. A plan is drawn up to seal the breaches in the hull, refloat the vessel with the help of large inflatable buoys, then tow it away. This will be the largest salvage operation ever attempted. It's estimated to take 7 to 10 months and, subject to weather and sea conditions, will start in May 2012 at a cost of $300 million. The contract for the salvage job goes to a joint venture between Florida-based salvage company Titan and Italian firm Marcoperi. Nick Sloan, a South African salvage master, is appointed to lead the operation. In June 2012, 6 months after the grounding, a barge is brought into place on the starboard side of the ship. The ship's radar, water slide, and funnel are removed to stabilize the ship and prevent it from sliding further down the sloped seabed. The ship's funnel is last to be removed in December, and by mid-January 2013, the salvage companies start to construct an underwater support structure. First, they create an artificial seabed of sand and cement on the downhill side of the wreck. They then build a metal platform for the ship to sit on. On the 15th of January 2013, 2 missing bodies are seen in the stern of the ship, but they aren't recovered from their inaccessible location in the ship. Between January and September, construction continues on the underwater platform.
The Costa Concordia has a huge gaping hole below the waterline, and so the engineering that goes into refloating it is brilliant. This segment of the video is sponsored by Brilliant. 15 sponsons are welded on the port side of the vessel, which is above the waterline. Sponsons are large airtight tanks.
By September 2013, the underwater platform is complete and the portside sponsons are attached.
Although they vary in size, one of these sponsons measures 33 meters by 10 meters by 20 meters. That means each sponson displaces 6.6 million liters or 2.65 Olympic swimming pools worth of water.
On the 16th of September, the salvage team start a process called parbuckling. Cables are attached from the platform to the port side of the ship. The cables are tightened using hydraulic tensioners called strand jacks. The ship is slowly pulled towards an upright position. As the ship rotates, the sponsons are flooded with seawater. The weight of the water in the sponsons helps complete the rolling of the ship to an upright position, resting on the underwater structure the next morning. On the 26th of September, a body is found in the center of the ship. Further inspections are made and sponsons are attached on the starboard side of the ship. On the 1st of February 2014, while welding the starboard side sponsons, a sheet of metal falls on a Spanish diver, trapping him and cutting a gash in his leg. Other divers are able to free him and bring him to the surface, where he bleeds out and dies.
On the 14th of July, salvage operators start to refloat the Costa Concordia from its submerged platform. The 30 sponsons can each displace around 2.5 Olympic pools worth of water for a total of 75 Olympic pools. That means they provide almost 3 times as much buoyancy to refloat the 60,000-ton ship, which needs to displace 24 Olympic pools worth of water to be neutrally buoyant. They slowly pump water out of all the sponsons until the ship floats free from the platform. Then they tow it a short distance from the coast into deeper water. This segment was sponsored by Brilliant. I'll leave a link in the description.
On the 23rd of July, they start a 4-day journey to the port of Genoa. Divers find body parts in the wreck while it's moored in the port. On the 3rd of November 2014, almost 2 years after the Costa Concordia is grounded, the last body is discovered in the wreck of the ship. Over the course of 2015, the ship is dismantled at a cost of $115 million, and the metal is sold for scrap. The Costa Concordia sat outside the island of Giglio for almost 2 years. During that time, souvenir hunters looted the ship, stealing cash registers, jewelry, furniture, artwork, and the ship's bell. When the ship collided with the rocky outcrop, the impact sheared 2 long strips of steel from the ship's hull. These were later found on the seabed 300 feet from the main island. Including victims' compensation, salvage, and scrapping, the total cost of the disaster is almost $2 billion, 3 times more than its $600 million construction cost. 33 people died in the incident, including 27 passengers, 5 crew members, and 1 salvage diver. Captain Scatino was charged with involuntary manslaughter. In his defense, his lawyers argued that the ship was cursed because the champagne bottle didn't break. He's currently serving a 16-year prison sentence, and I'm quite sure he's not sharing a bunk with a 25-year-old dancer from Moldova. Today, cruise liners must complete a mandatory evacuation drill before the ship sets sail. On a calm April morning, a large South Korean passenger ferry suddenly starts listing heavily while making a routine turn while navigating a channel between islands. There are 443 passengers on board, including 325 high school students on a field trip to Jeju Island. The students and passengers are told it's dangerous to leave their cabins, not to go on the outer decks, and to stay in their cabins as the ship lists and sinks further into the water. Some ignore the orders and head to the top of the ship. Others place their faith in the instructions from the ship's captain and crew. I've done my best to research this story. Where possible, I've used official reports to confirm details, and in places, I've abbreviated to tell the story in as succinct a way as possible. This is my understanding of events. If you've researched this more thoroughly or have additional information, please share it in the comments. The Seawall is a RoPax ferry, 145 meters long and 22 meters wide, with a capacity to carry 921 passengers, 88 cars, and 60 trucks. RoPax means a roll-on, roll-off vessel with passenger facilities. From 1994 to 2012, the Seawall sails in Japan under the name Ferry Namino as a cargo and passenger transport ship for the Japanese company A-Line Ferry. In October 2012, Shanghai Marine, based in Incheon, South Korea, purchases the Seawall from A-Line Ferry. It's already an old and somewhat dilapidated ship. Over the winter of 2012 to 2013, before the ship's registered in Korea, they make some fairly major modifications. They add 2 passenger decks and expand the ship's cargo hold. The Seawall's gross tonnage increases by 239 tons, from 6,586 to 6,825 tons, which means the internal volume of the ship is larger. Its passenger capacity increases by 116 people to a total of 956 people, including the crew. The modifications push the ship's center of gravity upward by half a meter and away from the center line. After the modifications are complete, Seawall is inspected by the Korean Register of Shipping and deemed fit for use. During the process of approving the modifications, the Korean Register of Shipping also changes the limits of what the Seawall can carry. They actually reduce the maximum amount of cargo the ship can carry from 1,450 tons to 987 tons, and they increase the amount of ballast needed from 1,333 tons to 1,703 tons. Although Shanghai Marine has increased the volume of the ship's cargo hold and intends for the ship to carry more cargo than before, the ships become less stable because of the modifications, meaning it must carry less cargo and needs more ballast to keep it level. After the inspections, the ship has a further 37 tons of marble installed in the gallery, which I assume is decorative. The ship goes into service in March 2013 with the approval of the Korean Register of Shipping. This is before the final report is released. It's quite difficult to determine the exact timeline, but it looks like the approval is given based on the blueprints for the modifications rather than the actual test report after the inspection. The blueprints turn out to be falsified documents. Almost a year later, the stability test report from the Korean Register of Shipping is finalized and dated the 24th of January 2014. The report states that the Seawall has become too heavy and less stable after the modifications were made. This report isn't given to the Korean Shipping Association, which is responsible for managing ferries, or the Korean Coast Guard, which oversees the Shipping Association and safety at sea.
Between March 2013 and April 2014, the Seawall sails a regular route between the city of Incheon near Seoul on mainland South Korea and Jeju, an island to the south of the mainland. The captain of Seawall, Captain Shin, warns Shanghai Marine that the Seawall is an unstable ship based on the final stability report. Shin's warnings were relayed to Shanghai Marine through an official working for the Incheon Port Authority on the 9th of April 2014, 6 days before its final voyage. Shin claims that the company threatened to fire him if he continued his objections. He also requests a repair for malfunctioning steering gear on the 1st of April, which isn't actioned before the ship sinks. On the 15th of April 2014, the MS Seawall prepares to set sail from Incheon to Jeju on its normal route. The ship is scheduled to leave port at 18:30, but fog reduces the visibility to around half a nautical mile, so the port authorities hold its departure. Despite a maximum cargo allowance of 987 tons, the Seawall takes 2,147 tons of cargo on board. In fact, some of the ballast tanks are emptied to accommodate cargo. The ship only has 761 tons of ballast on board instead of the 1,703 tons it's registered to sail with. I'm not sure if they intentionally substitute cargo for ballast and calculate the weight distribution, or if they're just trying to cram as much cargo in as possible. Either way, the cargo isn't properly secured before the ship leaves port. Fog warnings are lifted at around 20:30. At 2100, the motor vessel Seawall sets sail from the port of Incheon in South Korea. The Seawall is the only ship to leave port that evening. It regularly makes 3 round trips per week from Incheon to Jeju. Each 264-mile leg of the journey takes 13.5 hours to complete. The Seawall's been covering this route since March 2013, and so far it's made the round trip a total of 241 times. It departs with 443 passengers, 33 crew, and over 2,000 tons of cargo, including 185 cars. Among the 443 passengers on board, there are 325 students and 15 teachers excited about their field trip to Jeju Island. They come from Danwon High School in Ansan City near Incheon. The regular Captain Shin is on vacation. The ship is now under the command of 69-year-old Captain Lee Jun-suk, who's recently taken over command of the ship under a 1-year contract for which he's paid around $2,500 a month. He's an experienced captain with over 40 years at sea, and he's captained the Seawall on this route before. The next morning, 10 hours into its journey, the ship's made good time down South Korea's western coast. Passengers are waking up having spent the night asleep in their cabins. Most of the students are sharing cabins, and they've spent the evening and the morning laughing and joking and discussing the trip ahead. The Seawall is southwest of the South Korean mainland, a little way out from the Mangol Channel, between the Mangol Archipelago and the Jeolla Archipelago. I hope I'm pronouncing those names correctly. At 07:30, the ship's third mate, Park Han-kyul, takes over watch on the Seawall's bridge. Captain Lee is taking a rest in his private cabin. Park is a young and relatively inexperienced ship's officer at 25 years old and with 1 year's hands-on experience of ship navigation. 5 months of that experience comes from working on the Seawall. She's navigating the ship with the helmsman Shun Jung-ki at the ship's wheel. The Seawall's heading on a course of around 165 degrees at a speed of about 20 knots as it moves towards the Mangol Channel. The Mangol Channel has some of the fastest and most unpredictable tidal currents in the waters of the Korean peninsula. Sailing through it requires a great deal of caution, but it saves time, and modern ships with well-trained crews like the Seawall regularly sail this course. The Seawall's captain has chosen this route to save time following the delayed departure from Incheon. Normally, a more experienced officer would sail this part of the journey, but the delayed departure has also disrupted the watch schedule, meaning that Park is on watch for the ship's passage through the Mangol Channel. Conditions are calm with light wind and swell and good visibility. At 08:20, the ship's just over 2 nautical miles away from the channel. Park orders Cho to change the steering system from autopilot to manual steering. She wants complete control over the ship's steering for this important part of the journey. When the seawall arrives at the channel at 0827, it's on a course of around 137 degrees. The wider areas of the channel contain rock hazards and shallow waters, but there are no dangers in the path the seawall will take. As the ship approaches what will be its final turn, breakfast is being served in the cafeteria. Most of the passengers are up, moving about and beginning their day. The cafeteria is full of students. Other passengers are on the outer deck, smoking, entertaining themselves around the ship, or still asleep. At 0840, Park and Cho are on the bridge standing side by side near the ship's wheel. At 0846, the seawall is traveling at a speed of 18 knots on a course of around 135 degrees. Park orders Cho to change course from 135 to 140 degrees. As Cho alters course, he notices the ship list slightly, but isn't concerned enough to raise this with Park. After Cho alters course to 140 degrees, Park checks that she's happy with the ship's course on radar. At 0848, Park orders another change of course to 145 degrees. Again, Cho turns the ship, but the ship turns faster than he expects and continues to turn after he centers the wheel. Cho quickly makes 2 turns to port to compensate. In total, he turns the wheel 5 degrees to the left. The ship doesn't react, it continues to turn right. Park notices the ship is listing heavily and she believes the list is causing the ship to turn quicker to starboard than it should. She tells Cho to turn the wheel in the opposite direction. What she means is to steer the ship to port. She doesn't know Cho has already turned to port. When Cho hears this command, he thinks Park knows he's already turning to port and understands she means to steer the ship to starboard. This is in the direction of the ship's uncontrolled turn rather than away from it. Cho turns the wheel to starboard, and the miscommunication between the two sailors compounds the situation for the ship. There's a general sense of confusion, and Cho exclaims, "The wheel isn't working," in a flustered voice. In the canteen, people wonder if something might be wrong when they notice that the plates and tables are tilting. But they can feel the ship is turning and assume it's normal. The ship steers 15 degrees to starboard for a total of 40 seconds, but it turns about 45 degrees to the right, then rotates an additional 22 degrees on the spot for 20 seconds. It's like turning the wheel of your car slightly and the back wheels hit an oil patch, then spin out behind you. Soon, the ship is listing quite heavily to port, and it's clear that something's wrong. It's possible the currents made the situation worse. Then, passengers hear a loud bang from the lower levels of the ship as the cargo breaks free from its poor lashings. The ship lists further to port. At 0850, the seawall is listing 30 degrees to its left-hand side. The passengers suddenly find themselves on a capsizing ship, the beginning of a tragic fate for some. Captain Lee rushes from his cabin to the bridge. Soon, all the officers are on the bridge. Cho stops the ship's engines and the ship is left to drift sideways. The young third mate Park, who's understandably shocked by the suddenness and severity of the ship's list, starts to cry. Captain Lee and other members of the crew assess the situation and try to decide what to do. Lee can't tell if the ship will sink, but his focus shifts to the safety of the passengers. At 0852, Lee and his crew start planning for rescue while they try to recover control of the vessel. They need to be very careful about how to manage the situation so that everyone can be safely rescued from the ship, if that becomes necessary. The crew start to make announcements to the passengers while the ship is slowly capsizing. They tell everyone not to move, to stay where they are, and it's dangerous if they do move about the ship. These messages go out on the ship's public address system and are repeated until water starts flooding the passengers' cabins. Many of the messages specifically call on Danwon High School students to stay still. Meanwhile, the first emergency call to land is made by one of the students, Choi Duk-ha. At 0852, Choi calls the National Emergency Service number and reports that the ship he's on has begun to capsize. At 0854, Choi is connected to the Mokpo Coast Guard, a Coast Guard station in the southeast of the South Korean mainland, and he explains the situation to them. 3 minutes later, the Mokpo Coast Guard orders patrol vessel number 123 to the scene. The vessel is launched at 0858. Following the Coast Guard's search and rescue manual, patrol vessel 123 is put in charge of surveying the area and swiftly rescuing passengers. The announcements on the ship's address system continue to say, "Stay where you are." They're made by the ship's communication officer, Kang Hae-sung. He tells everyone that moving around the ship is dangerous. Other crew members repeat this message in person to passengers throughout the ship. When the Costa Concordia capsized, the crew gave similar instructions to stay in cabins and not move around the ship. The passengers ignored those warnings and made their way onto the deck of the ship. Quite likely because of an authoritarian culture, the majority of people on the seawall, particularly students of Danwon High School, obey the instructions they're given and stay below deck. Video footage taken by the students on their mobile phones will later be recovered from the ship. These videos show the students as they try to understand what's happening on the ship, and as they try to deal with the terrifying situation they face. Above all, there's confusion about how serious the situation is. At other moments, there's real fear. They're scared they might die. Others look for life jackets or think about whether the water outside is too cold for them to jump off the ship. They notice things like their shoes starting to slide across the floor. Others can see that the ship looks like it's sinking through the windows. The ship also seems to be getting darker. When will they tell us to evacuate? Are they making the right decision? Isn't this ship sinking? Others try to escape, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to leave the ship walking on walls instead of the floor. At 0855, the Seawall's crew make their first call to rescue agencies on shore. There are calls between the ship and the rescue agencies and between the different rescue agencies. Various Coast Guard agencies are informed as well as the South Korean Navy. 2 additional Navy patrol vessels are sent to the scene. Local fishing vessels have already arrived at the scene, some as early as 0900. The rescue agencies discuss the situation with Lee and his crew over radio. At 0920, the Seawall's crew report that the ship's listing more than 50 degrees to port and it's sinking lower into the water. At 0923, the vessel traffic service, who coordinates shipping traffic in the area, orders the crew of the Seawall to inform the passengers to wear life jackets. The crew replies that the ship's broadcasting equipment is out of order, and the vessel traffic service tell them to personally order the passengers to wear life jackets and more clothing to prepare for the cold water outside the ship. But there aren't enough life jackets on board for all the passengers. I wonder if that's why they tell vessel traffic service that the broadcast system is down. At 0925, vessel traffic service asks Captain Lee to decide quickly whether to evacuate the ship or not, saying they don't have enough information to make the decisions themselves. In response, Lee asks about the rescue, and the vessel traffic service reply that patrol boats are due to arrive in 10 minutes and that a helicopter will arrive in 1 minute. Lee replies there are too many passengers for a helicopter. He decides to continue to tell passengers to stay in their cabins, which Kang, the ship's communication officer, relays over the ship's public address system. It's possible there's a gap in the timeline and the broadcast system is already down. The Seawall is capsizing and the passengers are confused. They have to decide whether to follow the instructions from the ship's crew. Some passengers follow the announcements to stay where they are, even as they can see water rising in the ship. Most of the young student passengers continue to obey the announcements. Others move toward the upper decks rather than staying lower inside the ship. Patrol vessel number 123 arrives at the scene at 0930. It's the first official rescue ship to reach the site after the incident. It's appointed commander on scene. During the time between being dispatched and arriving, patrol vessel number 123 doesn't contact the Seawall directly on the radio. They call other ships in the area instead. When they arrive at the scene, crew members on patrol vessel number 123 aren't aware of the content of the communication between Seawall and the rescue agencies. They haven't spoken to the crew of the seawall, and they don't have a clear understanding of the situation. The seawall is listing more than 50 degrees to port. At 09:33, after confirming that nearby ships have volunteered to help in the rescue operations, the Vessel Traffic Service tells all ships to drop lifeboats for the passengers. Patrol Vessel number 123 begin rescue operations at 09:38 when they dispatch an inflatable rescue boat. Rescuers make announcements for 5 minutes calling for people to abandon ship and jump into the water. The decision to abandon ship is not taken by Captain Lee or the ship's crew. At 09:38, communication between the Vessel Traffic Service and Seawall is cut off. About 3 minutes later, roughly 150 to 160 passengers and crew jump overboard. Now, to evacuate the passengers trapped in the ship, the crew of the Seawall need to go below deck in a sinking ship and face near certain death. That doesn't happen. It's simply too late. Passengers on the upper deck and those who jump into the water are rescued. Rescuers are unable to get inside the ship to rescue the trapped passengers because the ship's list is so severe. Amazingly, one of the first people rescued is the ship's Captain Lee, who's photographed stepping from the seawall onto another boat in his underwear. Hundreds of passengers are still inside the ship following Lee's orders to stay where they are while he abandons the ship. Helmsman Cho, along with the first and second mates, are among the first people to be rescued with Captain Lee at 09:46. Other crew members trapped inside Seawall's pilot house are rescued after breaking through the windows. Of the 172 survivors, more than half are rescued by fishing boats and other commercial vessels that arrive at the scene before the rescue boats. The Seawall is sinking with hundreds of passengers, mostly children, still on board. They've done what they were told and stayed below deck. Their cabins are filling with water and now they have no way to escape. They continue to make calls and send messages from their mobile phones as the ship capsizes and sinks. Some of the messages are to say goodbye, some are to ask for help, and others show that passengers still don't realize what's happening. The last message is sent at 10:17. After the ship sinks, a tragically late sense of urgency takes over as resources are pumped into a desperate rescue operation. Navy ships, including a destroyer and a frigate, are sent to the scene along with other rescue vessels. Aircraft, including several helicopters, are also sent. Rescue personnel arrive, including 40 Special Forces scuba divers, 82 members of the Navy's ship salvage unit, and 114 members of the Republic of Korea Naval Special Warfare Flotilla. The Republic of Korea Army send units including 150 Special Warfare Command soldiers and 11 ambulances. Attempts are made to dive into the ship, but disturbed sediment on the seabed at around 40 meters deep makes it impossible for anyone to get inside. Rescuers are completely unable to get into the ship over the course of the day. At 00:30 on the 17th of April, the Coast Guard shoots flares into the sky to illuminate the capsized hull, which is still above the waterline. 8 Coast Guard commandos and Navy divers search for bodies and a possible point of entry into the hull of the ship. By 0600, 171 ships, 29 aircraft, and numerous divers are involved in the rescue effort. Throughout the day on the 17th of April, divers continue to try and gain access. By 2200, one day after the ship capsized, the rescuers have only been able to find 14 bodies. It's not until late in the morning of the 18th of April that divers gain access to the ship's hull via the ship's cargo deck. Everyone on board has drowned. In the months that follow, the confirmed death toll slowly rises to 304. 5 people are never recovered. The fallout from the sinking of Seawall and the loss of 304 passengers is enormous. The Seawall's captain, Lee Jong-suk, and various crew members are given a great deal of blame for the loss of their passengers. Their failure to order passengers to abandon ship, along with their decision to abandon it themselves, causes outrage. Within days of the disaster, the entire crew responsible for the Seawall's navigation are arrested. Captain Lee, First Mate Kang Won-sik, Second Mate Kim Yong-ho, and Chief Engineer Park Ji-ho are all charged with homicide through gross negligence.
Arrests are also made at Shanghai Marine, the Korean Shipping Association, and the Korean Register of Shipping. Captain Lee is sentenced to life imprisonment. The disaster goes on to have serious consequences for the government of South Korea and President Park, who was the country's president at the time. Park and her government were accused of being responsible for the lax regulatory environment that allowed the seawall to sail in an unsafe condition. As well as this, they were also accused of being responsible for the poor rescue operation that was launched for the ship. To make things worse, Park and her government attempted to downplay the disaster and control the public's reaction by controlling the information that was released. Park's popularity as president plummeted following the seawall disaster, and she never regained her popularity. A few alternative theories have been put forward and subsequently dismissed, including an explosion, hitting a reef, and colliding with a submarine. As with many large-scale accidents, there's not one isolated event that led to this disaster. Modifications changed the ship's center of gravity based on documents that were falsified to get approval. After testing the stability of the ship, those results weren't shared with the authorities that regulate the safety of commercial ships. The ship wasn't properly weighted with ballast, and the cargo wasn't secured to prevent it shifting during the voyage. An inexperienced crew were left to navigate the most dangerous section of the water on the route. After it became clear the ship was in trouble, the passengers were told to stay below decks, and they listened to those orders. When rescue agencies were informed, they didn't take control of the situation until it was too late. Despite making the first emergency call, Choi drowns in the capsized vessel and his body is later recovered from inside the ship. The order to abandon the ship was never given to the passengers below deck. Although the passenger count was lower than the Costa Concordia, the death toll was higher. In both instances, the captains were amongst the first to leave the vessel. I'll leave a link to the story about the Costa Concordia here.